Bueno, buenas noches. Me toca presentar al doctor Benjamin Powell. El doctor Powell es PhD por la George Mason University. Fue presidente de la API, Association for Private Enterprise Education, y senior fellow del Instituto.
What you were saying just before that.
Because I can read my own handwriting, sorry. Actualmente es director del Free Market Institute y fue de la Texas Tech University y fue profesor visitante en el Rhodes College of Business. Con nosotros entonces el doctor Benjamin Powell.
Muchas gracias.
You're welcome.
Muchas gracias, Carolina, and thank you all to the foundation and all of the people who have organized this wonderful conference, and to the translators who I'm going to try not to torture by speaking too fast. And especially actually to Juan Carlo and his whole family, who were great hosts to me for the weekend here, actually before the conference as well. All of them helped out, including Nicholas, who couldn't actually be here. For those who don't know, Nicholas was actually my PhD student at Suffolk University, so I had the privilege of helping him direct his dissertation. And I think he's absolutely wonderful. He's going to be, Arnie is a great Austrian economist and is going to contribute much more to the advance of Austrian economics and hopefully liberty in Latin America as well. And his contribution today was actually helping to pick my topic, which is still not up on the screen for me. And I asked him what would be a good thing to talk to you all about tonight, and he suggested research on anarchism. So what I would like to do tonight, my point of my presentation is going to be to do two things. One, to talk about the last 10 or 15 years, the advances that there have been in the study of self-governance and what we know about our ability to provide order absent state provision. Secondly, I want to convince you that the question, are you an anarchist or a minimal statist, is not a yes or no question. The answer is, it depends. It depends on what that anarchism looks like, and it depends on what that minimal state looks like, or if that minimal state is actually on the institutional menu of possibilities. So it's going to be a comparative institutional analysis. How are we doing with the PowerPoint here?
We're working on it.
All right. So this research program of the economic analysis of anarchy begins really in the early 1970s with Murray Rothbard publication of For a New Liberty, David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom. There's, of course, a long history of normative or ethical arguments about statelessness before this. But this is really the beginning of the analyzation of the economic mechanisms of how governance might work. Of course, Murray's book is also an ethical treatment. But within it, his chapters on the streets and roads and the police, law, and courts are kind of the first analysis of how might we provide this governance absent a state. And of course, David Friedman's book does a lot of the same. I should say that around that same time, there was a new research program developing in public choice economics in the Center for the Study of Public Choice at Virginia Tech University. Jim Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and their colleagues all started looking at what would a stateless equilibrium look like. They were much more pessimistic than Rothbard or Friedman about the ability to provide governance without a government. Jim Buchanan is a philosophical anarchist. He believes it's the normative ideal, but he's an analytical Hobbesian and believed that absent a state, you would get the nasty, brutish, and short outcome that Hobbes famously predicts. And that's evident in his book, Limits of Liberty, where he starts analyzing and that's the outcome, by the way, of that workshop that they started running in the early 1970s. And in it, he analyzes what would happen with people interacting in the state of nature, and basically posits that it's a prisoner's dilemma problem, and that each person's going to inefficiently predate on everybody else, and therefore we would not have a very efficient or nice society. Now, the irony, of course, is how Jim Buchanan solves this problem around 100 pages into the book, is he says, so in order to not predate on each other, we will establish a government. But then, of course, Jim Buchanan's known for endogenizing the economic analysis of government. At that point, what he says is, well, this government will be external, like an alarm clock, or like a referee in the baseball game. So he assumes the position of a limited government that he believes is the ideal without asking, is it attainable in his Hobbesian analytical world? And this is the question I'm going to look at today is, if we're going to do this, we need to compare Hobbesian individuals and anarchy with Hobbesian individuals trying to run a government, and whether you really get a limited one, or broader individuals that operate in societies with governments, how would they operate in statelessness of finding ways to self-order? Yes, but that's already loaded onto the hard drive right there.
What's on the screen? Why don't you have them do with what's on there before?
I'm just the speaker, not the technician. Thanks, Mark. All right, so in terms of ethics and economics on this, anarchism is not simply an ethical question. I am not convinced by those who say, listen, a state violates our rights, therefore I am an anarchist. I actually do believe that states by definition violate individual negative rights. But any anarchy that you have is also going to be imperfect. There's going to be crime. There's going to be theft. There's going to be murder. Those are violations of rights. Either system is going to have rights violations. It's a question of which system is going to violate more rights. Similarly, when people say states exist with taxation, and taxation, if we care about economic efficiency, has deadweight cost that makes society poorer. That's true too, but the deadweight costs of taxes are not fundamentally different than the deadweight costs of theft, which would also exist in a Hobbesian jungle. Both systems are going to be inefficient compared to some sort of utopian ideal. So the question is, how far off are each system from each other, and in which context would one be superior to the other? I should have mentioned after these other two that the evolution of this process then comes to Bruce Benson and Enterprise of Law, and of course de Jassé is in this tradition as well. And Bruce is actually the kind of public choice answer to Jim Buchanan, because Bruce Benson's book looks at the evolution of English common law and how it was done in basically a non-governmental system in its beginnings, and how over time the Crown infringed on it more and more and turned things that were private solutions into public goods problems. So it's a public choice of how law evolved. And this is a great foundation for this research, but the last 15 years have seen an explosion of far more. So is this an Austrian topic? I chose Mises with his thumbs up for a reason. Yes, it is an Austrian topic. Do I know that Mises was not an anarchist? Yes. But most of this research on economics of anarchism is published after he dies or when he's very old. Hayek did have time to read some of that. In 1978, he explicitly said he's not an anarchist. But this is irrelevant. My professor, Peter Betke, I love this phrase that he says, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And we do. These are intellectual giants. We stand on their shoulders. And we respect them. But how do we respect them? While you stand on their shoulders, you kick them in the head. That is what Mises did to respect Bombardier, and what Bombardier did to respect Menger, is we want to build on top of their theories, not just say, oh, what did they say their conclusion was? We want to say, what are their analytics, and might that push us to new conclusions? And I think that's particularly true in that guy's case. So if you think about Ruddy Wright's in economics, about competition as a discovery procedure, we don't know the answer to the competitive process until it plays out. And it plays out in the context of prices that give us feedback. Well, what does Hayek write about law? He writes about the judge discovering law. So it's also a discovery procedure here. But within a state system, there's not competition between different discoverers. There's also not profit and loss feedback of legal innovations. And the very common law that Hayek was so interested in later in his life was a spontaneously evolved system when it got started. For these reasons, I think a Hayek research program would very much be about the study of stateless law. In fact, there's a very good article I recommend to you by my colleague Edward Stringham and Todd Zwicky, and it's called Hayekian Anarchism. And it's an argument about why analytical Hayekians should embrace anarchism. So This I've covered already, that it's not an a priori question simply of yes or no. Instead, it's a comparative institutional one. So this here, what I've put up, this is your good stuff on the vertical axis. So either economic efficiency, wealth maximization, if we want to have that, or if you care about natural rights more than you do efficiency, think about greater respect for individual rights in total. I know you can't objectively quantify that, but use your imagination. You know that some places are much more unjust than others. Or if you're like actually most people who aren't philosophers, what you probably care about is some mix of rights and efficiency. And where you draw the line between that mix is a matter of your own kind of preferences. I believe in rights, but I would tickle someone's foot against their will if it would save the earth. I think most people have some trade-off there. So however you want to conceive of it, good stuff on that axis. Then size of the state. This being a maximal state, this being anarchy. What I drew up there on this one is kind of what I think Jim Buchanan's conceptualization looks like. So for Buchanan, with no state, nasty, brutish, short, bad outcome. For Buchanan ideal, some limited government. Then Buchanan, as he sees the welfare states grow, it's less efficient, less just, and if you get up to communism or totalitarian states, it's very bad. So the question that I want to ask in each institutional context, even if this is true, this does not equal I must always be in favor of having a state. Because if you think the state you're going to get looks like this one, there might be a better alternative. This minimal state is a unicorn. We never see it in the real world. Even in the United States, when we had something close to it in 1780s, it was very brief, and it starts its deterioration over a 200-year process. Then the other question I'm going to ask is, does this really look like Buchanan? Or instead, might it look more like that? So if this were an ideal, well, self-governance or customary law and other self-orderings of enforcement protect us from rights violation and help us secure gains from trade. And it doesn't do it perfectly, but it does it a heck of a lot better than a Hobbesian world. And the research I'm going to share with you, I think, points us in this direction. What I'm not arguing today, although it's not going to be mutually incompatible with my arguments, is this, that every decrease away in government is necessarily an improvement. That might be the case. I don't think I have the empirical evidence on this to make that argument strongly. I do think I have the empirical evidence to say that we're not going to be in a Hobbesian world. And once we're not in a Hobbesian world, and we realize we're not likely to get that, all of a sudden the empirical relevance of is statelessness preferable starts becoming more and more relevant in many real-world situations. So let's start with an easy one. After this next slide, you're all should be able to answer, sometimes I would favor anarchism. What were the institutional possibilities for Cambodia in the 1970s? If the government you're going to get is Pol Pot's Cambodia, that executes a fifth to a quarter of its own population, that's a pretty horrible outcome over here. If statelessness is able to provide any sort of governance, it's likely to be superior to that. Now, if your institutional possibilities are slightly better than Pol Pot's Cambodia, Mao's China, now maybe there's fewer instances where you prefer anarchism. But 30 to 60 million murdered Chinese is a pretty strong reason to suspect, unless it's a really bad Hobbesian jungle, you're better off than that. Make it a little better, this good guy. I'm going to guess the vast majority of Ukrainians would have done better in the 1930s in a state of nature with no government than living under this tyrant's rule. So let's try out these next two. Maybe it's better than them. Maybe it's not. I'd say both of them aren't quite as bad as the last three. But how far down are we there with them? And then the question is, how robust do we think our governance is here? And then maybe in some instances it becomes favorable, even compared to these other situations. I'm not making a priori claim about this. I'm using this as a thought experiment for you to think about, and you end where your own subjective assessment of these probabilities are. So it's not simply a Hobbesian state of nature that's awful or libertarian utopia. This is a picture from seasteading, Patry Friedman's thing. I personally don't really want to live on the ocean. So let's look at what I'd call kind of slices of anarchy. So we don't have a modern example of a developed economy with no government. What we do have today and through history are lots of examples of places where private governance functions and the state does not. And then it's a question of how much we can scale those up. So the objections of why self-ordering won't work are usually these three here. That there needs to be large numbers of people to cooperate, that they're going to be heterogeneous, and that they might not have multiple dealings with each other. The easy question is, can small homogeneous groups of people who deal with each other repeatedly self-order? That's an easy yes. So 15 years ago, this was the classic objection that those of us who were interested in non-state systems would hear. So much of that research has gone on to address what are these tough cases look like, where we have heterogeneous agents, many of them not repeatedly interacting with each other. So this is a new book. This, by the way, this is an exciting time for the study of this. In the last 12 months, 2 very important books have been published, and one more is about to. This is the one more that's about to. This one's Edward Stringham's Private Governance. Subtitle is still in the works. It's due out with Oxford in the next 6 to 12 months. So he looks, and by the way, each of these books that I reference, for those who don't want to buy the book or the book that's not out yet, you can look at any one of the author's websites. They evolve from a series of many papers that are studying these topics. So let's start with the Amsterdam Stock Exchange for Stringham. He studies the founding of the world's first stock exchange. There's no SEC regulating it. There's no government laws. And in fact, the people are trading options that are illegal by government law. So now if you have a dispute about what your contract was, there's no government courts to turn to. This is Amsterdam in the 1600s. It's a heterogeneous society with many immigrants who are participating in the stock market. But they evolved their reputations, and the gossip within the market would spread and enforce it. A reputation of a trader was their most valuable asset. If you lost your reputation, people would cease doing business with you. The London Stock Exchange, which emerged a little bit later, had even more traders. It grew bigger. Reputation alone wasn't enough. What they started doing then was ex ante exclusion. It became a private club, and the different traders, if you had a complaint with somebody, you could talk to the organizers of the exchange, and eventually you'd get kicked out of the club. So they sort out the dishonest people from dealings. How about PayPal and eBay? Think about eBay. What enforces contracts on that? People around the world trading. It's your reputation. Now, any one of the people aren't doing repeated dealings, but you're dealing with one person impacts your reputation with everybody else. And this enforces contracts. PayPal, Peter Thiel created, and the Russian mafia was stealing money through PayPal. He went to the US government, and the US government had no idea how these computer systems worked. His own fraud prevention technology developments. That's what enforced his property rights. The government was incapable of doing it. Stringham also talks about private policing. There's more private police officers in the United States than there are government police officers. They range in quality from the low quality shopping mall security guard to how many of you have ever been to Las Vegas? Super high security. Now I know how long the lag is. Also, adjudication by contract. So, arbitration and mediation in the United States, very quickly growing business. And it's growing around the world, too. In fact, think about trade between businesses between countries. Often it's not enforced by the government's courts. It's through mediation or arbitration of international jurists. And think about how this operates. Both parties have to agree to a judge, which means if that judge doesn't have a reputation for both fairness and knowing industry custom, they're not going to get very many people who would agree to them ex ante, even if you don't know which side of the dispute you're going to be on. But this actually gives us a monetary feedback mechanism on which judges are creating what the community views as the efficient or best law. This process is absent in government law. My friend Peter Leeson, Anarchy Unbound, again, after many papers that study these subjects. Just a couple examples. So one of the original problems, heterogeneous populations. You need to be more alike to trade with each other. He points out heterogeneity or homogeneity is not a one or nothing thing. You can modify yourself different ways so that you're homogenous with the group you want to trade with, just on the margin. And the people who make this costly signal are signaling that they plan on having enough dealings to make it worthwhile to make the adjustment of their homogeneity. That means they're not going to defraud you. Now you can trust them. This can be adopting another religion, learning another language, or something cheaper of just changing your appearance to fit in. So he studies groups in pre-colonial Africa that did exactly this in order to be able to engage in trade. And not everybody from both groups had to do it. Just one or two people from one group do it with another, and they serve as the middlemen. Strong versus weak, when one party is much stronger than the other and can always renege on contracts. He studies tribes that set up arrangements where they come and they make the contract before there's any goods to plunder. And then when the strong comes back to make the trade, the only thing that's there for them to take are the goods they already paid for in advance. Kind of innovative way to come up with this. And of course, and you might know of this from his previous work, looks at groups of people who use violence in their own self-governing system. This is his work on pirates. So finding pirate ships in the 1700s would actually have constitutions with checks and balances and prohibited activities of their own members. And they did this to provide governance among the thieves so that they could maximize their plunder. Now, of course, for the rest of the world, this wasn't good, but it is self-ordering in a hard situation. Speaking of hard situations, this is one of the hardest. Prisons. So David Scarbeck, actually also a former student of mine, he's a professor at King's College, London. Why is this one of the hardest cases? You have people who have high time preferences, probably. They committed crimes. They have a history of using violence. They can't exclude non-cooperators. The prison forces you together. And they're severely constrained in what type of things they can innovate because the prison guards are watching them and impacting their behavior. Yet what Dave finds is that it's prison gangs that provide most of the governance, or much of the governance, within the American prison system, not necessarily the guards. he looks at the evolution, and this, by the way, wasn't always the case. It used to be the convict code, a code of conduct between people who are incarcerated. Those people who broke the code were punished by the other inmates. But the population, partly related to the war on drugs, of the American prison population has gone way up. Reputation doesn't work anymore. Now you need a third-party approval for reputation. So instead you have a Latino gang, a black gang, a white gang. They tend to do it on racial lines. But now the reputation that matters is the whole group's, the gang's reputation. Because the gangs are trying to facilitate business in prison, often drugs, but other contraband. And they have an incentive to make sure contracts are enforced and people are remaining relatively peaceful. A lot of the beatings and worse that occur in American prisons are done by the members of the same gang to their own members because the own member did something wrong to another party, and now your own gang enforces behavior on you in order to preserve order. They actually even have, I put it in quotations, constitutions that prescribe behavior. There's an elaborate one for the Northern California Mexican mafia. And they often use very violent enforcement to get these things done. By the way, there is a theme between these three. Edward Stringham's work is almost all about non-violent enforcement, other mechanisms that provide governance. Peter Leeson's and David Scarbeck's, or Peter Leeson's is mostly about violent enforcement. Scarbeck is maybe in between, but dealing with very violent people. One of his most interesting examples, it's not in this book, but it's in his next book that's coming out, although I think it was published in the Independent Review, is on a Bolivian prison, where he finds all the guards do is make sure everybody stays inside. After that, you're on your own. And what he finds is private property, enforcement, and business. Actually, people, since all the guards do is keep the convicts in, people from the outside come in and trade with them and then go back out. Go in, get your hair cut by the prison barber. But this tells you the degree of order that they're creating in there. Very interesting article. All right, so those are all kind of slices of anarchy, anarchy within the shadow of the state. We do have one modern example of a country that's completely stateless, and that's Somalia. Since its government collapsed in 1991, it has not had a state. At first, now it was, by the way, an extraordinarily predatory state that they had. In fact, that's Somalia's entire experience. Under colonialism first, then under their government, became a predatory state right away. Their state finally collapsed in 1991. At first, it would look like a Hobbesian jungle. Rival clans all fought each other to try to become the new government. They wanted to make sure they were going to be on the taking end rather than the giving end of the plunder. But shortly after the United States and UN left, they realized that none of them were strong enough to make themselves the new government. And a relative peace emerged. And Somalia actually started improving. It periodically gets disrupted, usually by outside interventions. But when left alone, it starts governing itself. It's not perfect. I'm not moving there. I attended a conference in Abu Dhabi about rebuilding the Somali nation state, and I was definitely the unpopular guy there. But this one German anthropologist played an absurd video that showed Somalia as libertarian utopia, and was like, libertarians are crazy. So I changed my whole talk after he did that and got up and basically said, he's crazy because he thinks he's going to design a constitution for Somalia and that it's going to look something like that minimal government arc I gave you. There's no reason to believe that in Somalia. They've had no experience with that. In fact, look at their neighbors. Their neighbors don't give you much encouragement in that direction either. So the point is not that this is libertarian paradise. It's not. It's a desperately poor country in Africa that struggles. The question is, do they struggle better without a state or with a state? And in their case, I think the answer is very clear that they do better without. Because they have governance without government. It's not a Hobbesian jungle. So they have a customary legal system called the Zir. It's not unlike Old English common law. It prohibits basically mostly negative rights violations. It prescribes through what they call the dia payment system how much you have to pay somebody if you've committed a crime. So there are no jails. Jails are deadweight costs for everybody. We only see them where states exist. Throughout human history, people usually used restitution as a way to solve the problems. Somalia does. But the way their governance works is very interesting for those of us interested in liberty and stateless systems. You're born into a dia paying group, your social insurance group, and you're part of a clan. If you have a dispute with another clan member, you turn to your clan elder, who makes a decision, and then your peers force you to make the payment. But if you have a dispute with someone from a different clan, you each go to your own clan elder, who then meet with each other and try to mediate. And if they can come to a conclusion, that again is going to be enforced on you by your peers. If they can't come to a conclusion, they go to a third clan and say, how would you interpret this? And whatever they rule is the binding custom. They're supposed to be trying to find out what the custom is in each individual case. So the way the law is found is through this dispute resolution process. Clan elders who don't do a good job are replaced. They're not like hereditary titles. And people change between groups. So you're born into one, but you can leave it and move to another one as long as they'll accept you. You can also be thrown out. So if you're perpetually a problem, your clanmates aren't going to like you. Because every time you do something bad, if you can't pay for it, they have to pay for it. So you see now the reputation of the dia paying group and the larger clan are what's valuable. So you can have many anonymous individuals in society interacting, but the reputation value for your clans are what needs to be known, and then what your peers enforce on you. So they have law that looks like common law. It's discovered by their judges, and there's competition between the clans for members. We've got a competitive discovery process for law here. Incidentally, I put money up there just because I'm in Argentina. You all know something about inflation. Somalia, when their state collapsed, anybody could print money. So some people would predict an infinite rate of inflation. Didn't happen. They had a high rate of inflation, and then it stabilized. They've had a stable price level for more than 15 years. Nobody will accept bigger than a 1,000 Somali shilling note because that was the last legal tender they had. So they inflated until 1,000 Somali shillings equals 3 to 4 US cents, which is roughly the paper and ink cost. As far as I know, it's the only 100% backed paper currency the world has ever seen. But the key is that they can't add zeros. But as a unit of account, it's stable. Interesting. So they have roads like their neighbors do at about the same rates. They provide security privately and through their own clan enforcement. And actually, the kind of ultimate public good, maybe national defense, they've done a pretty good job with. They kicked the United States out. They kicked the UN out. The current government doesn't even control the whole of the capital city. It would seem like they're providing national defense well enough. Maybe it could do a little better. So this here, I'll do this just briefly. You can look this up. I've got a paper, Somalia After State Collapse, Chaos or Improvement, that does all of this. But so we look at what are the institutions they have to provide governance, and then we say, well, how do they do? This is their rank. This is the absolute number, but this is their rank among 42 sub-Saharan African countries and the provision of each of these things that are kind of measures of standard of living. This is the only ones that we could get for Somalia and this cross-section of countries. In fact, we can't get reliable GDP per capita data for Somalia because we can't even get accurate per capita. So what we see, it's out of 42, that on these, some they do very well. Some they're down near the bottom. But for the ones that they're down near the bottom, they were down near the bottom before they lost their state. In fact, what we see for most of these is a decrease in the last 5 years of having a government, of them getting worse. Then some of them stayed worse, but a lot of them improved. Somalia didn't just improve its own standards of living, it improved faster than its peers throughout sub-Saharan Africa in many of these. Incidentally, an important one, the life expectancy. It was one of the biggest improvers in life expectancy in all of Africa over this time period. At a minimum, what we're seeing is not Hobbesian, and relative to the state that they were going to have, seem to be doing a little bit better. You can also look, because some countries in Africa were having wars, so the question is, are wars driving it? You can instead look at countries that just had wars at about the same time of Somalia, how they've done since then versus Somalia. Somalia has increased faster than most of them in most of the standards. So I'm going to wrap up here in just a moment so that we can take questions. Implications for Africa. There's many weak and failing states who only exist because international NGOs and governments around the world prop them up. George Aidi, my favorite African economist, wrote, "The rogue African state should be left to the fate it deserves, implosion and state collapse." Many would respond, "But my God, you'd get Somalia." My answer is, that's an improvement for a lot of them. So more broadly, our conclusions on this: anarchism is a progressive Austrian research program where many Austrian economists are making advances. It's a very Hayekian program. It's policy relevant in two different ways. One is for weak and failing states where their state alternative is really nasty. The other, though, is anarchism is not simply a yes-no question even in developed countries. The question is, can we do more with private governance than we already do? And I think there's many slices of life that we can expand on this without making it a wholesale abolish the state type question. So I think this research, some libertarians would say, oh, it's just not relevant, it's, you know, pie in the sky, we're so far away. Well, actually, no, a lot of the world isn't that far away, especially once we think of it as a comparative institutional question. And there's also smaller ways that can change our policies in other countries. So from tonight on, I hope I've convinced you, if someone asked you, are you an anarchist, you can say, at least sometimes. Thank you.